Hello fellow Unreal Engine artists, designers and developers, and today I'm pleased to announce the release of another freebie, my Auto Landscape Material tool. I've been doing a series recently on how to create auto landscape materials from scratch, and I decided to package everything together, including some extra features, and release it so that you can use it in your projects. It's available from Unreal Engine 5.4 and above, and I'll quickly talk you through the features it provides. To start off with, it supports up to 7 layers of textures with automated creation based on slope and the ability to create manually painted textures as well. From Unreal Engine 5.5 onwards, it supports Nanite displacement. You can vary the rotation, the color and textures for a more natural look across the landscape. You can create puddles on the ground layer. It has PCG templates for adding rocks, foliage and trees, and runtime virtual texture support for enhanced performance and blending of the meshes onto the landscape. It also has ocean features to prevent texturing and spawning beneath sea level, and finally some menu-driven tools to enable fast creation of your new levels. With that out of the way, let me show you how to download and install it, and then I'll talk you through the new features. To download the Auto Landscape tool, head to ko-fi.com. The link is in the description below, and you will find this shop page where you can select how much you want to pay and download it. However, it is free, so you can just put in 0 in the amount and then download it. If you want to put more, I'd be grateful, but it's absolutely not necessary. Please download it for free and enjoy it. Once you've downloaded it, you'll have a zip file which you can then extract. Once you've extracted that, you'll have 2 folders. You'll have the main content folder and a short PDF which just explains the basic installation and setup. That's what this video is going to do though. And if you open up the main folder, you'll see all of the subfolders. There's 3 variations of the auto landscape material, with 1 or 2 custom layers, and then some sample maps, sample textures to get you started, and some sample meshes as well for PCG. So that's how you know you've got everything. Next thing is obviously to add that into an existing project. To add the Landscape Auto to one of your projects, simply select the UB Landscape Auto folder, do Ctrl+C to copy it, and then find your project. So I've set up this Test Landscape 5.5 project, open it up, go into the content folder and paste the Landscape Auto in there, and now it'll be ready to use in the project. So if you go into your project and you open up the Content Explorer, you'll now see that UB Landscape Auto folder with all of the subfolders I mentioned earlier and the materials on the top level. There are a couple of project settings we need to change and plugins we need to add. So go into your plugins folder and look for Procedural Content Generation Framework. Set that. Say yes, you understand it's experimental, and restart your project. And once the project's restarted, we also have to do a project setting change as well. So open your project settings, search for virtual textures, and we'll need to enable virtual textures so that our runtime virtual textures work. And also, by default, you probably want to uncheck the Enable Virtual Texture on Texture Import. We don't want all of the textures you bring in being virtual textures. So switch that one off. And again, we need to then restart the project. Once you've restarted your project, open up the Content Explorer again, and we'll enable these landscape tools, which provide some useful features for especially setting up new levels. So you can see this Editor Utility widget here called Landscape Tools. Right click and do Run editor utility widget, and it'll appear on the top left here with various buttons and options, which we will use throughout this video to set up things like PCG, RVT, and different elements, especially on your new levels. I've provided a couple of sample maps to walk you through the features. So if you open up the maps subfolder, you can see this Glacier Valley level. So let's double click to open that, and I'll talk you through the general parameters. It takes a little while to open up the first time as it compiles all of the shaders and does all of the sort of mesh operations. But you'll notice that there is a resizing virtual texture pools message that appears at the bottom for the RVTs. So while we're in the editor, let's do something to prevent that from coming up regularly. So go into your project settings, and on the left hand side, if you scroll down till you find the virtual texture pool section, you'll notice there is some transient pool set up. If you look at both of those for the two different formats, you can see that the size is 182 and 77 megabytes for the second one. So that's, you can add those together. It'll be different depending on resolution that you're working in, but that is the amount you want to put in the fixed pool. I'm actually going to make it a little bit bigger to allow for expansion. So I'm going to make it 512, and I'm going to uncheck the pool auto grow in editor so that you don't see that message popping up all the time. So now we're back on the landscape. You can see that it comprises 5 different levels. You've got this sort of ground level on the valley, a grass layer, which is the mid-low layer, some soil at the mid-high layer, cliffs that appear just before the snow layer, and then the final snow layer itself. So that's the standard 5 layers. You can also add 1 or 2 custom layers as well. And then you can assign PCG templates. So we're spawning rocks on the ground layer, we're spawning clumps of grass on the mid-low grass layer, and then we can go to the landscape tools and click the cleanup button on PCG temporarily to hide the PCG elements. And this prevents them from spawning while we're changing our material. I've also used Control-Shift-H to show that the current frame rate is around about the 120 frames per second mark. There's no need to be running at that higher frame rate while you're developing. So save a little bit of energy for your PC, go into the landscape tool and hit the 30 FPS button to reduce that. Just remember to come back and change it to max FPS before you deploy your project. All right, let's now look at the material and go through all of the parameters that you can change. So choose your landscape and go down to the landscape material. So for this sample one here, we've got a material instance called MI Glacier Valley. Browse to that and open it up. Okay, so I've put the material instance on the right hand side of the screen. You can see it comprises various parameter groups, the sort of general landscape parameters, and then 5 different layers for ground, mid-low, mid-high, cliffs, and snow. So I haven't opened any of these up yet. These are just the groupings. And then we've got a special one for ocean levels, which I'll show a bit later on with an island level, how you can have water level spawning. And then finally a variation for things like texture variations and color variations to add more realism to landscape. And there's a dedicated puddles layer as well, which you can see at the bottom of the landscape here for generating puddles on the ground layer. So let's turn off some features at the moment. So if you go into the snow layer, you can switch off the snow. And after it recompiles the shaders, you can see the snow no longer appears on the mountaintops. We can also go to the landscape variation and switch off the color variation. And now the textures on the landscape are a single color with no color variation, just the texture color. And we'll also switch the puddles off as well by using that checkbox by add puddles. So the puddles will disappear as well. So this way we're just keeping it to a very simple 5-layer material, and we can concentrate on those parameters to start off with before revisiting the ones we've just switched off. You can change the lighting if you want as well. Just move the lighting around. Control L will allow you to rotate the sunlight until you get it looking the way you want it. And let's start off by talking about the general parameters in the landscape general feature. So first two here are the tiling factors. So you may notice that there is a different tiling factor in the foreground of the camera and the background of the camera. So that means when you're close to the camera, you see a bit more detail, but further back, you don't see the tiling being too repetitious. So you can see that the near tiling here is set to 0.3 and the far tiling is set to a different value. So if I change the near tiling to 0.03, the same as the background, you can see that it changes the size of the tiling in the foreground. And similarly, if I change it to 0.3 in the background, it's much more densely packed. So these default values will get you started with the far tiling, 10% of the near tiling. And you see as you get closer to the ground, you can see the detail in those rocks. The way it changes, or the point at which it changes, is dictated by these distance, blend, start and fade. So the start position is where the line is. So if I change the fade length to 0, you can see the harsh line where the two items blend. Obviously you don't want a harsh line like that, it's too obvious. So, but you can change the blend start, you can push it back, or you can pull it back forward nearer the camera. And then you can then add the fade length, distance blend fade length. I'm putting 5,000 in here. So over 5,000 units, it'll blend from the near tiling to the far tiling. And then the next output is the show runtime virtual texture output. At the moment, it's computing the materials on a frame by frame basis. Takes a little bit more performance, but gives you the highest fidelity. However, it also writes to something called a runtime virtual texture, which projects onto the landscape and streams as required. And this is better for performance at the cost of more memory, but for lower end devices, it can be quite a useful technique. And even without that, it's using the runtime virtual texture to blend the mesh elements like the foliage, which we'll show later on in this video. So if you switch the runtime virtual texture output on, it won't look much different. It's now using the runtime virtual texture to show the landscape, but it is a limited resolution. It looks pretty good in here at the moment, but it is slightly lower fidelity. And if you go into the landscape auto folder, go to the RVT folder, you'll see that there are the runtime virtual texture assets that hold height, displacement, and the color. If you open up the color one, you'll notice that it has these sizes. So I've set this to 10, 2, and 2. If you put higher numbers in there, you'll get higher resolution, but it'll require more memory. So this is a sort of a good median value for resolution and performance, but you can change this if you want to. The final parameter in the landscape general is this add manual paint layers. We'll talk about that a bit later on, but this allows you to then paint layers manually onto the landscape rather than just rely on just the automatic creation of textures based on the slope and other parameters. Moving on to the layer parameters now, we have up to 7 layers. The standard 5 layers here, plus up to 2 custom layers. Each of them are broadly the same parameters, with a couple of extra ones in the cliffs and the snow layer, which I'll cover later. But if you open up the ground layer, this is the layer that you're seeing running through the valley in this glacier valley map. And you can see that it has the first parameter here of ground slope. And this is what dictates the flatness of the terrain that this appears on. So you can see if I hover over it, you see the tooltip. So 0, it will show everywhere, and 100 is fully flat. So we've got a mid number here of 30, so it appears just on the valley floor. If I reduce the number to 20, it now creeps up the sides a bit. 10 creeps up the sides even more. So let's put it back to 30 so that it's just on the valley floor. So that's kind of a key parameter for each layer to dictate how much it shows and where it shows. Now the next things to look at are the textures. So there are 3 textures in each layer. The base color texture, which as the name suggests, shows the color information. The normal texture provides the illusion of 3D, and the final texture, the ORD texture, has ambient inclusion, roughness, and displacement information in the 3 channels, the red, green, and blue channel. So let's move the parameters across a little bit so you can see a bit more. And you can see for the base color, as well as the base color texture, we have this tint value here. So you can see at the moment it's a slightly darker tint from white. If I raise the value, it becomes lighter. If I decrease the value, it becomes darker. And I can also change the color tint as well. So I could put it into the blue part of the spectrum for a cooler color, or into the yellow, sort of orange for more of a desert sand type view. But I'll cancel out of that and leave it at its neutral color. And then the last parameter I want to talk about here is the aspect ratio. So by default, textures are square, usually square, and so the aspect ratio is 1 by 1 sided. But if you look at this texture, you can see the resolution here. It's 2K texture. It's 2048 by 2048. So that I can see now that it is a square texture. But if you have some textures which are larger on one dimension than the other, then you'll need to change the texture aspect ratio accordingly to, if it's 2 by 1, you need to change it to 2 or 0.5, depending on which side, which dimension is larger. But usually 99% of textures are a value of 1, so you can leave it at that. All right, let's talk about the normal texture now. So as I said, that provides an illusion of 3D. So you can see as I get closer in there, the stones look, in fact, I've just realized now that I've got the runtime virtual texture on. So if I switch that off, I'll get a sharper image because it'll be full resolution. So let's switch that off. And right, going back to normals, you can see that where the rocks are, there's the illusion of the shadows around those rocks, and that's governed by the normal information. So by default, there is a normal intensity value of 1, which means that it's just the standard normal value. If you change that normal intensity to 0, then you can see we lose all of that 3D information. It just is now just the base color only. If you put it back to 1, now we can see those shadows around the rock. You can even make it higher if you want for a deeper effect, but don't push it too far, otherwise it will look unrealistic. So the normal intensity is a way of adjusting the 3D look on that texture. Displacement is the next thing, but we're not going to talk about that yet. We'll talk about that in a later chapter of this video, but it's governed by this texture here, which has ambient inclusion, roughness, and displacement. So the first option here, or the first channel, has ambient occlusion information. And so I've set by default the ambient occlusion intensity to 0. Ambient occlusion is the sort of self-shadowing around textures. So if I change that to 1, you'll see it's quite subtle, but there's a bit more shadowing around the crevices of the landscape. Again, you can push that if you want, but I'll put that back to 0 for now. And then we'll talk about the roughness value. So roughness by itself won't show up without some wetness on the landscape as well. For those of you who are technically minded, wetness is the specular value of the material, but roughness can't show without some specularity or wetness on the landscape. So you can see at the moment that's set to 0, so very dry texture or very dry landscape. But if we set that value to 1, then you can see it takes on a sort of a shiny or wet plastic look. And now, if there was any roughness information there, it would show up in certain patches. Anyway, I'll change that back to 0. I'll show you in the mid-high layer, where we do have some actual roughness information, how it actually shows. So can you see how the rocks, particularly in this area here, are sort of slightly shiny? If I open up the mid-high layer, you can see I've set the wetness value to 0.1. So only a little value, but you can see the difference. If I set this to 0, that specularity and roughness doesn't show up at all. So just a small amount of wetness enables that roughness to be differentiated from the dry portions where the stones don't exist and the wetter portions where the rocks are. So that's a good example of where wetness and roughness work together. Okay, moving on to the next two parameters, we have multipliers for near tiling and far tiling. So we've set up the near tiling and far tiling in our landscape general. Those are these 0.3, 0.03 values. And they apply across all layers of the landscape, but you might want to do per layer variations if things are too densely tiled or you want to space them out. So by default, you have this parameter value of 1, a factor of 1. But what you can do is you can change the factor here in order to make the tiling more densely packed or more spaced out. And you can see lower values create larger textures. So generally speaking, you'll leave that at 1 to start off with. And then the last two parameters here are tiling variation. If I switch these off, you can see that it is very obvious the repetition of the tile. You can see there's a sort of straight line going ahead with the same pattern repeating. And what the tiling variation does is it introduces random rotations of the tiles. And then when you switch them back on, those random rotations hide that repetition by rotating randomly across different areas of the landscape. And there are a couple of parameters which dictate this rotation scaling. And in the landscape variation section, there are these rotation variation scale and levels value. You probably don't want to change these. I've played around with these to find ones that I think, numbers that I think work well. But by all means, try out different scale and level values and see if it works for your particular landscape. Okay, so that was the parameters for the ground layer. You'll find that the mid-low layer has exactly the same parameters. It has a checkbox to switch it on or off. So you don't have to have the mid-low layer showing. By default, you can have different combinations of layers. So you can have, well, snow is always independent. You can have ground and cliffs. You can have ground, mid-low, mid-high, and cliffs, or just ground only. Those are the combinations that you can have. So you see if I switch the mid-low off here, then now we just see the ground layer, the cliffs layer. No snow because we don't have that switched on. So yes, you can use that parameter to switch on and off layer, the add mid-low, add mid-high layer, add cliffs layer. So at the bare minimum, you could just switch off mid-low, mid-high cliffs and just have ground layer. But arguably, that's just a single texture material anyway. You wouldn't want to use my auto material just for a single layer. So here we are adding the cliffs, and then adding the mid-low, adding the mid-high, and we're back to our 4-layer landscape without the snow. So other than the switch, the mid-low and mid-high layers have exactly the same parameters as the ground layer, so you can play around with those. So just you want to change the textures, so you can see we've added here a grass texture on the mid-low layer, and you can change the slope. So we've got a slope of 5 at the moment. If I make that slope a lower value of 3, it will go further up the hillside. Put it back to 5 and it brings it back down so that the mid-high layer shows through. Again, the tiling's pretty obvious there at the moment, so we can switch on our tiling variations near and far to do the random rotations of the tiles to hide a little bit of that repetition, although this will be hidden under PCG grass later, so it'll be less obvious. Mid-high has all the same parameters, and the cliffs has mostly the same parameters, but it has 2 additional parameters at the end of the layer for triplanar projection. What that means is that where the cliffs get more vertical, it can stretch out the texture. It's a little more costly to use this triplanar projection, but it does give slightly better results. So you can play around whether you want that on or off. At the moment it's on, so let's switch it off. And it's a very subtle difference. You'd probably have to use the grid pattern to really see the difference. But with it off, it's using the tiling multiplier, the far tiling multiplier here. We've got that at 0.2 to make the texture a bit larger, but it is stretching it, particularly on that tall mountain at the back. And so if you want that to be a less distorted texture, then you would switch the triplanar projection back on. And once you've switched that on, the triplanar texture size governs the size of that texture. It's no longer based on the tiling multiplier. So we can change that triplanar texture size from 16,000 units to a lower amount, and that will create smaller texture sizes. And you can go back to 16,000 and you can see that the texture size becomes larger, so you can see more of the cracks in that texture. The last layer we need to talk about is the snow layer. So let's add the snow now. And again, that's got all the same parameters as the other layers, except it has 4 or 5 new parameters that are just specifically snow related. And this is an independent layer which you can add on at any time in your level at the top of the landscape. So if we switch off this snow breakup amount, so let's make that 0 at the moment. We'll come back and talk about that in a minute. You can see that now we have a fully covered mountain of snow. The snow slope parameter governs what slope level it appears on. So 0 means it appears everywhere over a certain elevation. So generally speaking, you want to look at the transition and the start height. So if I make the transition 0, we've got an unnatural harsh line there. And the snow start height is the elevation at which the snow begins. So if we change that, you can see that the snow goes further up the mountain or further down the mountain. And now you can see the transition value here. You want to put quite a high value there. So I'll put in 5,000 and that blends that in at that transition line, or even 10,000 to make it even more blended. Now the snow slope dictates above that elevation which slope levels that appears on. So 0, it appears everywhere. But if we change that value, you can see that it's still only above a particular altitude, but it is only appearing on more horizontal slopes. So you can do that up and down. And then the soften parameter dictates how harsh the contrast is between the slope and the non-slope bits. So 0, it's a softer blend, 0.5 in between, and 1 is a harsh contrast. And we'll now make the slope 0 again. Moving down the parameters, we have this snowfall angle, and this is the angle at which the snow falls. By default, it's a value of 1 on the z-axis, which means it falls from above, which is what you're seeing here. But we can change that to have it coming from different directions. So if we make it 1 on the x-axis, for example, and we move around the landscape, you can see it comes from the right-hand side of the landscape. And you can have combinations of this as well. So we could have -1, which is coming from the left-hand side, and we could even add in coming from the top as well by putting 1 on the z-axis. And now it's coming from the left-hand side and from the top, sort of from a 45-degree angle. Similarly, we can do it on the y-axis instead. So have it on 1 on the y-axis, and now if we move around, you can see that it's being projected from the front of the landscape, or -1 from the back of the landscape. So you can use combinations of these if you want to have the snow coming from a particular direction rather than directly downwards. Okay, now let's talk about the breakup amount that we switched off at the start. At the moment, that's 0, but if you put any value other than 0, it'll introduce some noise into the landscape so that you can see through to the cliff underneath. So a value of 1 here is full breakup. And then you can specify the contrast of that. 0 is a sort of a soft view. 1 is a harsh view. You could even go harsher. And the breakup size at the bottom is the size of those particular holes. So if you make it a different value, like 3000, you'll get large texture breakup. 300, you will get smaller breakup. 30, you'll get tiny spotty breakup, which doesn't look very natural. So I'll put it back to 300 or 700 for a more natural look. And those are the extra features of the snow layer. Now it's time to talk about the variation options. We talked earlier about how you could switch on these near and far tiling variations for rotations, and we had these parameters in this landscape variation section that you could change for the variation scale and levels. But there are 2 other types of variation we can add to the landscape as well, which again adds some randomness and realism. So the first one is this color variation. So if you switch it on, you see that it now has sort of some darkening of the coloring around the landscape, and this applies to all levels except the snow level. You can change the intensity, so 0 goes back to having no color variation at all. And if I put a value of 1 there, it will be a full variation, which is too much because it's almost black. So that's probably overdoing it. So put it somewhere in between the 2. I'll set it to 0.7. And then the next parameter is the contrast. So you can either have a soft blend of color, or by putting a value of 1, you have hard edges where those colors meet, which that works quite nicely in certain landscapes. So you can have anywhere between those sort of 2 extremes. You can have it somewhere in the middle if you wanted as well. And then the last parameter is the tiling of the pattern. That's the size of the breakup, the size of the color patches. So by changing that to a lower amount, you get smaller patches. And then by increasing it, you get larger patches that are spread around. So you can play around with that. The next type of variation you can do is this texture variation. This is only on the ground layer, but it allows you to mix in random textures from the mid-low and mid-high level at the ground level. So you've got the option, first of all, to do a blend of textures, either the mid-low texture, the mid-high texture, or a combination. So by setting this to 1, it's just adding in the mid-high texture along with the ground texture. So you can see there we're getting the stones of the mid-high texture randomly interspersed. If I make it a value of 0 here, it will be the mid-low layer mixed in, which is the grass layer. So you can see now it's grass and ground rocks, and you can do it in between as well if you want. 0.5 will do a little bit of both. So we'll set that to 1, so it's just the ground layer and the mid-high layer mixed together. Next parameter is the intensity of this mixture. So if you set it to 0, then it's as if you haven't done any blending at all. It's just the original texture. And if you set it to 1, that's a full blending of the two. And then you can do something in between to suit your taste. Next option is the contrast between the textures. So you can have a soft contrast between the two. So it's a sort of a very feathered edge where they meet, or anything from 1 or above will do a harder contrast between where the textures meet. And the tiling, just like with the previous tiling size, allows you to specify how big the patches are of random textures. So you can have larger patches of texture or smaller patches, but more frequent, depending on that value. So those are the variations, and I would highly recommend using them for creating more variety on your landscape. Now let's talk about puddles. If we switch those on, it adds water puddles to the ground layer with some parameters to dictate how they look. And you can see, particularly if you look towards the sunlight, that you can see these small puddles with slight wetness around them. And we can adjust things like the size and the shape of these. So let's go through the parameters that you can change for this. First one is the puddle size, and you can make them larger or smaller. If you make them larger, they may appear less often on the landscape, but where they do appear, there will be larger puddles. And similarly, if you make them smaller, they'll be spread less frequent, more frequent, but smaller on the landscape. So you can play around with those parameters to get the puddle amount that you want. Again, make it very large, very small for different looks and feels. The next parameter is the puddle constraint parameter, and this dictates how much water appears along the landscape. So if you make that a very low value, like 0, you've pretty much flooded the landscape with water. And as you increase the values, nothing really happens till you get to about 3 or 4, and then you see you've got water in a smaller area, but a very large puddle size. It's not until you get to 10 or above that you start to get much smaller puddles. So in combination with that, you can then adjust the depth or perceived depth of the puddle. So if you make a low value there, it's like the water level is very low, and as you increase the size, the puddles spread out in perceived depth. So a combination of the size, constraint, and depth will give you the puddle layout you're looking for. And then this last parameter is clarity. So if you make it a value of 0, it's very dark, almost like there's been an oil spillage in your landscape. If you make it a value of 1, it's a perfectly clear puddle where you can see the texture underneath. But I find that by reducing the amount slightly, so making it slightly dirty, so something like 0.5, 0.6 or 0.7, it just allows that puddle to show up a little bit more on the landscape, because most puddles have a little bit of muddy water in them. So that's usually a good parameter. So that's the puddle section of the landscape material. At this point, let's open up our landscape tools menu again, and let's regenerate our PCG element. So click the regenerate button under PCG, and what it'll do is it will execute the PCG volumes and regenerate our rocks and grass on this landscape, so we can see how that looks. And you can see that we now have our rocks on the ground layer and our grass in clumps on the mid-low layer blended in, so you can see what everything looks like together before we explore the final parameters of the material instance. Now let's talk about displacement on the landscape if you want to add that in. So you can add it on to any layer except for the cliffs and snow layer, and it will create real displacement from your ORD texture, the occlusion, roughness, displacement. If you get your textures from Quixel Bridge, which is still working at the moment of this video, then it will download ORD textures. So first thing is you need to go to your landscape, and you absolutely need to make sure it is set up as Nanite by enabling Nanite and then clicking the build data or rebuild data button to build the necessary data. The displacement won't work without a Nanite landscape. Also note that I'm on version 5.5. It does work on 5.4, but really not very well, so I wouldn't recommend it at all. Just do this on 5.5 and above for a decent experience. Okay, so once you've checked that your landscape is Nanite, go to your material instance, and what we can do, I'm going to actually switch off the texture variation here so that we just have a single texture on the ground layer. It'll just make it easier to see the result of applying the displacement. I'm just going to get closer to the ground so you can see the rocks at this level. We'll go to our landscape tools and we'll do cleanup on the PCG just to get rid of the rocks and grass. Just makes it a little bit easier to see what we're doing. We'll switch that back on later on. And then go to your ground layer, and you'll notice when we go down to the displacement section, so we've got the ORD texture, which has got some displacement information in the blue channel. We've got add ground displacement set on at the moment, so you might be thinking, well, why aren't we seeing any displacement? So that's because that's not the only thing we have to do in order to create the displacement. So if you look at the ground displacement parameter here, add ground displacement, it's on, but what we need to do is we also need to go down to the material property overrides. You can see if I hover over that parameter, it says make sure tessellation is enabled in the material property overrides. So it won't actually do the displacement until we add that parameter or check that parameter. So further down the material instance, we've got this enabled tessellation, and you need to check that on. And once you've done that, it will quickly recompile the shader and you will start to see some displacement. There's not very much displacement in the texture, but you should see that there is a few of those small rocks being elevated on the landscape. So if we go back to the ground layer, you can see that we have the displacement amount there. So we can, it was set to 1. If we set to 2, that shows up a bit more clearly. Now you can see those little rocks that are showing there. And if you run around on the landscape, you will see that there's no collision on this displacement. So you will see that the feet somewhat disappear into those raised rocks, and that will show you the displacement's working. I will say that if you download Quixel Megascans with displacement, that the displacement maps are pretty good, especially for sort of rocky terrain, and they will really show some good displacement on the landscape. But remember, it comes at a bit of a cost. You need to evaluate that yourself, but there's certainly an overhead in adding displacement. So you can change the amount and then you can switch it on or off by using that tessellation control. So far, everything on the landscape has been automatically applied, but what if you want to manually paint some textures on the landscape to assist in your particular vision of how the landscape should look? So there is an option in the material instance to switch on manual paint layers, and then you can go to the landscape section and use that. So if you go to the landscape general and click on manual paint layers, you'll see that it will again do a quick recompilation of the shader. Nothing will change at the moment. But what you can do now is you can go into the landscape mode, and if you go to the paint section, you will see that you have layers for each of the different sections. So ground, mid-low, mid-high, cliffs, snow. The auto material has its own layer as well, which is just filled in with all of the automatic stuff, and then you can blend your other elements on top. So if you pick one of those layers, you can even see the textures in a little thumbnail to the side. You can then select each one and paint onto it. So let's select one of these layers. Let's do the ground layer, for example. Let's say we want to paint it going up into the grass. We can select that layer. If you don't see the layers there, you can click on this Create Layers from Assigned Materials. This is new in 5.5 and above. I'll show you this later on in the creating your own level, so you can see how you would do this in the custom side of things. So let's select our mid-low layer, which is our grass. Then we can do things like adjusting tool strength and brush size. So let's make the brush size a bit smaller. And then what we can do is just paint onto the ground layer here. So I'm just holding the left mouse button down, painting around here. And what it will do is, after I let go of the button, you'll see that I now have the grass layer on top of that ground layer, manually painted. And if I don't like what I've done, I can use Shift and left mouse button to erase that layer, so you can see that's disappearing and revealing the ground back underneath. So you've really got full control over the different layers and how you paint them. And similarly, if I wanted to paint the ground going up into the grassy hill, I could select that and hold my left mouse button down, and you can see I'm painting a path using the ground layer texture going up the hill. And again, we can do erasures if we want to, or soften the edges with some of the tool parameters. So it's nice and simple to add in those elements manually that you want to add. If 5 layers aren't enough for you, you have the option to add 1 or 2 more custom layers. This is just for manual painting, but just be aware that they will add a little bit of an overhead to your material. So you can see at the landscape auto folder level that there is the main material, and then there are 2 other materials that are called +1, landscape auto +1 and landscape auto +2. And they add one custom layer or 2 custom layers on top. You could switch between these as you require, switching on layers or getting rid of them, going back to the original. So the way you change a layer, so this is the standard layer we're on at the moment. If you go to the material instance and look at the general section, the parent, at the moment you've got the landscape auto parent, which is the standard one with 5 layers. But if you select one of the ones below, like the landscape auto +1 or +2, then it will adapt the parameters. So let's select landscape auto +1. And you'll notice that there is a new parameter group there for custom 1. Now you must have manual paint layers switched on in order to use this, because this is only a manual layer. Nothing automatic will happen. You've got to paint this on yourself, but you have all the standard parameters here, as in the other layers, for setting up your textures, and all the other different parameters for the layer. So you should be familiar with those from the earlier discussions. So now if you go to your landscape mode, go to your paint layer, you will see there's nothing there at the moment, no new custom layer. So what you'll have to do is, depending on whether you're on 5.4 or 5.5 and above, if you're on 5.4, you might just be able to restart the level and it'll be there. But from 5.5 above, you can just click this Create Layers from Assigned Materials button, and you should see now at the bottom of the list, there's now a new custom 1 layer. It doesn't have a layer information asset associated with it yet though. So there's nothing that's going to store that paint information. So what you'll need to do is you'll need to hit the plus button to create the layer info. You're going to create a weight blended layer. Just click save. It usually saves it in a sensible place along with all the others. And you can do a Control-Shift-S if you want to save it. I usually get in the habit of doing that to saving all my project assets. And now you've got the layer info in there, you can start painting on the landscape. So we can select it, and if we use our left mouse button held down and just paint on the level, you should see the default texture, the white grid. We haven't actually assigned any other texture to it yet, appearing there. So now we have that custom layer. And if we don't want it anymore, we could go back and reset the parent back to the standard landscape auto. The last parameter group we need to talk about is the landscape ocean group. And this is a set of parameters that control where the ocean level or sea level is in your landscape if you're using water. And it will prevent the PCG and landscape grass from spawning beneath the ocean. And it will also prevent the texturing from appearing on the slope beneath the ocean level as well. There's an example map I provided. If you go into the map section, I've provided an island map. Now, you may not see it in your project, but that's because you need to have the water plugin enabled in order to see the island map. So go into your edit plugins section, search for water and select it. It will say it's experimental, say yep, you know that, and restart. Once your project's restarted, you'll probably get this message saying that there's no collision profile for the water body. So if you go to the end of that message, you'll see there's a little link there, and you can click that, and that will add the collision profile to the default engine config. So just do that first of all. Now you can come out of that and go back into the landscape auto folder, the map subfolder, and now you can see the island level appears there. So you can double click on that to open it up. It may take a little while to open up the first time while it does all the various calculations, but it should open up quickly on every subsequent time. And you'll see a island with grass and palm trees generated by PCG, and it will be surrounded by an ocean water body. And you can see that we have a different material instance associated with this, still based on the standard auto landscape. You can see I've gone on sort of aerial view here, and our ground level is now a sort of a sand texture instead of the gravel texture we had before. So if I switch off the water body here, you can see that beneath the water level, it's the sand that appears, even though there's a slope there, and really something like the grass should be spawning on that slope. Due to the landscape ocean parameters, it's preventing that from happening. So let's have a look in the material instance for this landscape and see how that works. So go down in the landscape to the landscape material. It's this MI island. So go into your content browser and open it up. So just like before, I've put the material instance on the right-hand side of the screen so we can see that, and then see the level on the left-hand side. So if you expand the landscape ocean parameter group, you can see that we have this ocean level threshold checkbox, which is checked on. And this is why the sand is appearing beneath the sea level. If we turn it off, after a brief shader compilation, you'll see that now the grass appears on that slope beneath the sea level because the slope parameters are forcing that to be generated there. So what that checkbox does is extends the ground layer of the sand from the sea level and lower. So let's switch it back on, and now you can see that it's sand beneath the sea level. And the next two parameters dictate where the ocean level is and a blending transition between the sea level and the other textures. So if we go back to our outliner and switch the water back on, the water body ocean, so we can see it with water in place, we can play around with these other two parameters to show you what effect they have. So if I change the transition to 0, you can see you get a harsh line there between the ocean level that we've set and the next layer up, the mid-low layer or grass layer. And that looks too artificial, so what we want to do is use the transition to do a blend. So by putting something like 200, you can see now the grass blends into that ocean level. We can reduce the ocean level as well. If we make that 0, it's exactly where the ocean is. So you get an exact match there. But what I've actually done is, or you can put it below the ocean level as well. And then I can set the transition to a larger amount, say 500, and that's blending that grass just beneath the sea level. But the other thing that this impacts as well is because our grass and trees are spawned on the particular layers that we're generating. In this case, they're being generated on the mid-low or grass layer. By preventing the grass from spawning underneath the water, we're also preventing grass and tree meshes from being spawned by PCG as well. So it's a useful feature of the material also for the foliage and making sure that's not generated under the water as well. Now, I've provided 2 methods for generating the meshes on your landscape, and by meshes I mean your foliage, so trees, grass, and also other items like rocks or indeed any meshes you want to generate. So those 2 methods are landscape grass types, which is an old but tried and true method for generating. It has a lot of limitations, but it's still a nice quick way of getting things set up. And the second method is procedural content generation, or PCG, which gives you much more customization and flexibility, but it's a little bit more time consuming to set up your own custom graphs. So I've included both, and you can mix and match them. So in the Landscape Tools menu, if you hit the Cleanup button, it will stop the PCG from spawning, and I would suggest you do that while we go through the main features. And you see in the Landscape Auto folder, there's a Landscape Grass Types subfolder with a landscape grass type for each of the different custom layers, from the ground up to mid-low, mid-high, cliffs and snow. So this is where you define what meshes you want to appear on those layers using landscape grass types. So if I open up the LG ground, which is the landscape grass type for ground, you can then add elements, as many as you want, for, it calls them grass varieties, but it's actually any mesh. So for example, we could open this up, add one, look for rock. I've got a sample rock in the landscape material. So if you click that, you can see that you've got rocks everywhere on the ground layer. Obviously far too many at the moment, so you can reduce the density, so this grass density amount. So if we reduce this to 4 per square meter, it's still probably too many, so let's do 0.4, or we could even do lower than that. You can uncheck Use Grid if you want it to be a slightly looser pattern of generation. And you can also set the cull distances where the meshes will stop being shown in distance from the camera. So change the end cull distance from the default there. It will show closer or further away. You can change the scales or the scale values. So if we have sort of a minimum and maximum scale there, let's do 0.5 to a maximum of 2 times the scale. Now you've got some variation in the size of those meshes. One thing it doesn't do, landscape grass types, is collisions. There are various other parameters, but you can never have collisions on. So for something like trees, you don't really want to run through trees. So you don't want to be using landscape grass types for that. You want to be using PCG, where you've got a bit more control. And if we now open up the mid-low layer, this is where the grass is being spawned on the landscape, and we could add some healthy grass in the grass mesh there. And if you get a bit closer up, you'll see there is our grass, and you'll notice that it's inheriting the underlying texture color. That's because the healthy grass mesh I provided has a material that uses runtime virtual texture blending to blend with the texture of the auto material. And that's why you're getting sort of drier grass in the foreground and greener grass where the actual grass texture is. So you can see that landscape grass types are nice, a quick way to set up what you want, but you don't really have much control over the way it's laid out. It's literally just a spread varied by the density amount. There's no way of doing things like, for example, clumping of grasses or little scatterings of rocks in certain areas. That's where PCG gives you much more control. So let's talk about the PCG templates I provide and how you use those. So before we demonstrate PCG, what I'll do is I will delete the grass varieties on the landscape grass type for mid-low. I'll I'll take it off on the rock as well. So delete it on the rock, and you can see now we have a completely clean landscape. If you then go into the landscape tools menu and click on regenerate under PCG, it will now execute the PCG graphs, which also generate rocks and grass. But you'll see that it generates particularly the grass in a much more sort of clumped pattern. So let's talk now about PCG and how we set those parameters up. I've provided 3 sample PCG templates for you to use in your project, and you can look at those and see how they're comprised to create your own. So under the landscape auto section, if you go into PCG folder, you'll see these 3 for grass clumps, rocks and trees. They have different parameters and different logic in them, but you can use those as your jumping off points for your own as well. And they're included in the sample levels, so you can see how they're integrated. So with the Glacier Valley map open, this uses the PCG rocks and PCG grass. So let's talk about the rocks first, and then we'll jump into the other 2. So the PCG rocks template is set up to create large rocks that are sort of scattered around less densely around the landscape, and then smaller scatterings of smaller rocks in little clumps. And then we've got parameters to dictate how those are generated. So if you select it and go to the PCG component, you'll see if you go into the graph, you've got these parameter overrides in the details panel. And you can see the first parameter here is the landscape layer. So it dictates which landscape layer it appears on. At the moment it's set up to this ground layer. PM just means physical material. That's where it's written to in the auto material to drive this. So you can change which layer it appears on. If you didn't want it to appear on the ground layer, you could change this layer and have it appear somewhere else in your landscape. So for example, if I put it to the mid-high layer, where you can see one sort of up on the hill there because of the culling distance, but it's now not appearing on the ground level. If we put it back to the ground, then you can see it reappears on the valley floor. The next parameter is the large rock mesh and the density, how many large rocks per square meter, and then the minimum and maximum large rock size. So that governs the appearance and amount of the large rocks on the layer. And then we have the base adjustment, which again something you couldn't do in landscape grass types. You can adjust the base to have it sink into the ground. This is especially useful for trees, where on slopes you don't want the base of the tree appearing to hover above the landscape, so you can sink it into the ground. And then we have the culling distance for the large rock, which dictates how far away from the camera it's shown. So we can bring it closer to the camera or further away, depending on how many meshes you want to display. And then the rest of the parameters in here are to do with the small rock groups. So you can specify a different mesh for the small rock, although I'm using the same one here. And then we have a few more parameters dictating clumping size and the spacing, randomness of those clumps. So you can see that there's a bit of variety here in what we provide. Now in the outliner, if you now select the PCG grass clumps, this is the PCG graph that dictates the grass, and currently it's on the mid-low layer. And you can see that it's set up so that it does grass clumps, like there's a central grass point, and the grass has grown around each of those central grass points. So it's much more natural looking, but with a bit of randomness thrown in those clumps as well, just like it would be in real life. So we've set up different parameters for this PCG volume to drive that. So again, if you select the grass clumps and select the PCG component, you can see that we start off with the same parameter for which layer it appears on. At the moment, it's set to appear on the mid-low layer, and the grass meshes is healthy grass that I've packaged up for you. But now there are different parameters. So the clumps per square meter, so that's a sort of seed of each of those groups. You can obviously have a reduced clumps per square meter. So there are still the same clump size, but there are fewer of them around. And then you can specify the size and the spacing of the grasses within each of those clumps. You can specify minimum and maximum sizes for variety, and some random offsets and base adjustments, just like you saw before in the rocks. But this is now more geared towards grass generation. So we put the density back. You can see that we've gone back to having lots of grass on there. So to show you the last PCG template, I've opened up the island sample level, and you can see that I have these coconut trees that are spawned on the mid-low layer here. And this is using the PCG trees template. So if you select that in your level, and then if you go down to the PCG component, and you'll then see the property overrides, and there are tree specific parameters here. So some of the parameters are the same, which layer it appears on, the mesh, the density, and the minimum tree size, but there are some additional elements as well, like the base adjustment. I've sunk it 100 underground, and the growing angle dictates what the sort of underlying steepness is for it to grow on, so it won't grow on steep angles. Similarly, the altitude, if I increase the altitude to 10,000, you can see that you have trees on the mountains because they're above that level. But if I reduce the altitude to 2,000, those trees that are on the hilltops no longer appear. So those are the extra parameters for trees there, including the culling distance as before. Now, one final thing I want to talk about with regards to foliage is that you've got all this foliage being automatically generated, but sometimes you might want to paint out the foliage in certain areas, to remove it in certain areas. So I provide a remove foliage layer that you can paint on in order to remove the rocks, grass and trees in certain areas. So let me give you an example. Say I wanted to paint out the grass that's on this little beachy area in the island. What I can do is go into the landscape mode, and then if I choose paint layers, you'll see that as well as the standard layers that we've been using, there's this remove foliage layer at the bottom. And what we can do is we can paint on that, and anywhere we paint, it will remove the foliage on that particular part of the landscape. So just select the brush and paint. So you can specify brush size, fall off, hold the left mouse button down and paint on those areas, and you'll see that once you let go and it regenerates the PCG, that now that grass no longer appears in that area. If we want to restore it, we can just use Shift and left click to paint it, and that will erase the remove foliage mask, thereby restoring the grass back there as well. So I'm doing that now, and you can see that the grass is back. So that remove foliage layer is useful just for tidying up certain areas, adding a little bit of manual finesse to the foliage meshes. Now we get to arguably the most important part of this tutorial video, which is how do you set up your own level and apply the features and techniques that I've been showing earlier in this video. So let's say you're setting up a new level in your project, or you've got an existing level. Let's just set up a new one for the purposes of demonstration. So I'm going to choose the basic new level here, and I'm going to delete the floor and player start, and we're going to create a new landscape. So I'm going to go into landscape mode, create new. I'll use the Glacier Valley height map. I'll provide it in the link below if you want to use that, but you've probably got your own levels or height maps that you're using. So I'm going to import from File, choose the Glacier Valley height map. At this point in time, I'm not going to apply a material. I'm going to just change the scale on my example to 75 on the Z, so it's not quite so high, and click on Import. And we'll end up with a landscape with no material on it, so you'll just see the standard procedural grid on the landscape. I'm going to save it. I'll just call it test level. And you can see if I look around, it's the Glacier Valley, but without any of the auto material or landscape grass or PCG applied to it yet. So I'm going to take the exponential height fog and I'm just going to reduce that to 0.01 and the fall off to 0.1 just to make it a bit clearer what I'm doing. And the next thing we need to do is we need to assign a material. So let's go into our landscape auto folder, right click on one of the materials. I'll just choose the basic one with 5 layers. So that's the UB landscape auto, although you could use the +1 or +2 if you need 1 or 2 extra custom layers. So right click and do create material instance and call it whatever you want. I'm going to call it MI test level, and with it still selected in the landscape, I'm going to open it up and go into the landscape and find landscape material and use the selected asset, and that will assign this new MI test level. And what you should see is still a grid pattern, but this is now using the auto material to apply the default grid patterns everywhere. So next thing we want to do is open up the material so we can start playing around with the different options. Remember that if you want to use displacement on your landscape, you will need to set the landscape to Nanite and click on the Build Data button. If you're not using displacement, you don't have to do that. It's optional whether you want to do that or not. All right, so now let's open up our test level. And I've put them side by side, so as I change parameters, you can see the effect it has on the landscape. And you can see that a whole load of default values at the moment. In fact, you haven't even selected them to change them at the moment, so you'll need to select them on the left-hand side if you want to do any changes. So let's start off with looking at the layers. So by default, the mid-low layer switched off, the mid-high layer, the cliffs, and the snow. So all we've got on our landscape at the moment is the ground layer. So you can decide which combinations you want. So landscape general is set up with different tiling sizes for the near and far ground. No RVT is being output at the moment. And manual paint layers are off by default for painting your own manual layers. So let's start off by finding a texture to apply to this ground level. If you go into the Landscape Auto, I provide some textures, although you can download those from external sites as well. So let's go into the textures and the rock subfolder. And there's some 2 or 3 different textures here. And what you can do is you can drag those into the material instance. However, if you just try and drag it at the moment, nothing will happen because you need to select the parameter to change it. So let's switch on the 3 textures, the base color, normal, and ORD texture, and now we can drag in this large stony ground. So base color, normal, and the ambient occlusion, roughness, and displacement. And you can see on the landscape now, we now have that across the whole of the landscape. Albeit the tiling is a little bit obvious because we haven't got any tiling variation yet. You can see the difference though between the near and the far tiling. So we need to maybe add the near tiling and far tiling variation. If you remember, that applies random rotation. So now it's less obvious where that repetition is. So that's our first ground layer. So what we could do next is add another layer. So we could add the mid-low, mid-high, and cliffs if you wanted. So you see if we do the mid-low layer, now we see the ground texture just on the ground slope. And we've got the default textures for here. So let's drag in a grass texture. So as before, we need to select the textures to enable them to be changed, and we'll use the grass field, color, normal, and ORD. And you can see now we have the mid-low layer where the grass layer isn't, and we can now add mid-high layer as well. And you can see that the grass now only goes up to a certain portion, and then the mid-low layer would appear. So again, select those textures. And for this one, let's import them from Quixel Bridge, just so we don't use my sample textures. So as of the recording this video, Quixel Bridge was still working, even though Fab's been launched. So you can go into Quixel Bridge. Don't forget to sign in with your Epic account. And you can search for particular surfaces there, and there's a wide variety of surfaces available. So I'm going to search for a rock texture. So click on rock, and I'll actually I'll search across all the assets here, and then choose surfaces. And then I'm only really interested in rock and those sorts of rocky surfaces. So I'll select one of these. So here, the desert out background mud rocky 01. That looks quite good. So I'm choosing medium quality, which is a 2K texture. Again, the texture quality depends on the end target for your project. If it's a game, I tend to go for medium quality 2K or less. If it's a cinematic 4K, it's probably what you want. And then click on add, and you see you get the material and the 3 textures. So luckily Quixel Bridge does base color, normal, and the ORD texture you want. I believe that Fab at the moment does ORM for the 3rd texture, so you don't have displacement. So you'll have to find a way of getting height information into that displacement channel if you want to use displacement. But now we have it in our project, we can now drag it into the mid-high layer. So we'll drag these base color that we've just downloaded, the normal, and the ORD texture. And now you can see that above the grass line, we have that new Quixel Megascans texture. All right, let's now move to the cliffs layer, and we'll click on add cliffs. So cliffs appears, it doesn't have its own slope parameter, it just appears wherever the other slopes run out. So again, we can get this from anywhere. I'm going to actually just use this inbuilt textures in my cliff layer. So switch on the 3 textures to change, and then I will drag in the cliff base color, and then I will actually use the normals from the dark cliff because they have more cracks in them, and the same with the ORD from the dark cliff. So you can mix and match if you want to as well. And that provides a cliff texture on the edges of our mountains. And we'll use triplanar projection as well to change the size of that texture and make it vertically unstretched. So I'm going to change that texture size to 16,000, and you can see that the texture size has got larger on those mountain sides. Okay, so that's our basic layer setup, but we can do adjustments as well now, and you would probably want to spend your time doing this. First of all, exposure. If you go into the tools here, you can click on manual exposure, and it will add a post-process volume automatically for you. You can change the exposure of that level to suit your requirements. I tend to set the performance to 30 frames per second while I'm developing. It puts less strain on the PC while I'm working on my landscape. And then looking at it, the grass seems a little bit on the light side. So let's go back to the mid-low layer and select the color tint for mid-low. And it's set to fully white tint at the moment. So on the value side, let's reduce it so you can make that grass a little bit darker. It might look different when we've actually generated grass meshes on top. And we can also make it cooler by pushing it into the blue spectrum, or warmer by pushing it into the yellow-red spectrum. So obviously you can spend a lot of time setting up your material instance exactly the way you want it to, but I'll leave you to customize it to your heart's content. The next thing I want to talk about is if you want to set up manual paint layers on your landscape. So if you find your material instance and reopen it up, in the Landscape General section, you'll want to check on Add Manual Paint Layers. And you'll notice that your landscape has gone invisible. And this is because we need to set up the paint layer info for this landscape for the first time you set up a new layer. So go into the landscape mode, go to the paint layers, and you see it says there are currently no target layers assigned to this landscape. If you're on version 5.4, you will probably see things there, but you haven't yet added in the layer info. On 5.5 and above, you will see a button that says Create Layers from Assigned Materials. So click on that, and all the material layers appear. And in 5.5, it seems to have created the layer info for me as well. But in 5.4, you'll probably have to hit plus next to each layer in order to create the layer info in the right place. So just be aware of that. They're all weight blended layers. So for the auto material layer, you need to make sure to fill it in order for the auto material to have somewhere to be written to. So right click and do fill layer. And after a second, you'll see it will write all of that auto material information to that layer. The other layers, then you have the option to do manual painting, as I showed you earlier in this tutorial video. So you can select any of those, for example, the ground layer, select your brush size, paint on the landscape, and you can see I'm painting the ground layer going up the hill there. Now let's talk about how we add PCG graphs to our level. So go into the Landscape Auto folder and the PCG subfolder, and there you've got your 3 samples there. So let's say I want to add all 3, grass, trees and rocks. I can simply select all 3 of these. If you right click under the scripted asset actions, you'll see a UB Auto Landscape Add to Level custom action, and you can see that they have been added into your level, grass, rocks and trees. If you don't actually see anything yet on your landscape, go to the UB Landscape Tools and click on Regenerate under PCG, and that will force the generation of all of those elements. So you can see now that I've got some grass, some rocks on the little rocks on the grass layer, some grass and some very low poly trees. Deliberately generated at low volume so it doesn't strain your PC too much. But one thing you'll notice is that the rocks and the grass don't really blend into the landscape very well. Obviously you can go and change the parameters for these PCG generation, as I showed you a little bit earlier in the video, but we aren't getting the blending because we don't have any runtime virtual texture assets yet for this landscape. So that's the next thing we need to set up. So reopen the landscape tools and you see you've got these various RVT options here. The first thing you need to do is decide whether you're going to use displacement in your landscape or not. If you do want to use displacement, when you click on the Verify RVT assets, you'll get color, displacement and height as RVT assets. So you'll need the displacement in order to hold that information. But if you uncheck displacement, you'll only store color and height information. So you decide, depending on whether you're using displacement or not, what you're going to do. Let's assume we are going to use displacement. So click on Use Displacement, Verify RVT Assets. And the next thing we need to do is we need to add the runtime virtual text to the landscape. So click on this button and it tells you that it's been assigned to the landscape. Unfortunately, the next part of this you need to do manually. I couldn't find a way to automate it. So it tells you what to do, but I'll talk you through it. So select the landscape and scroll down until you find the virtual texture section. And you will see our 3 elements there have been added, RVT, color, displacement and height. We just need to click on this Create Volumes button. And you'll see it's created 3 volumes in the level. The last task we need to do is give them more meaningful names. So go back to landscape menu and just click on rename. And you'll see they're now called meaningful names: RVT color, RVT displacement and height. And you will see now that the small rocks and the grass are now a much better color blend with the texture. They're not black anymore because they're using the RVT blending with the generated runtime virtual texture. We could now select the grass clumps, for example, go to the PCG component, and just like I showed you earlier, we have all the parameters we can change. So we could go in there and change which layer it appears on, what meshes we're using, and more importantly, we might want to increase the density of those meshes. So instead of 0.001, if I make it 0.01 and wait a second or two for it to regenerate, you can see now we have a lot more grass on that layer. The final topic I want to cover in this tutorial video is how to blend meshes in with the underlying landscape using RVT blending. So you can see as an example here, I've imported a Quixel Megascan of this rotten tree stump, but it doesn't really blend in with the underlying texture. So the way you do it, there are two ways of doing it. I'll show you both. So if we take this tree stump as an example, what I'll do is I'll highlight it. I will go into the material. You can see it's a material instance, and we need to actually find the master material for this. So go into the hierarchy and you should have something like this, the default material, whatever the parent material is, and then you will have a final output for that material. Now it'll either be a big box with all of the pins for color, normal, and all of the other attributes, or if this use material attributes is checked on the material, it will just have a single material attributes box. So if it's a material attributes box here, all you need to do is create a little bit of space here, right click, type RVT, and you want to use the RVT blend using MA, using material attributes. And then all you need to do is plug into the input and plug the output into the material attributes. And that will give you the parameters necessary for doing the blending with the underlying landscape. So let's have a look at that. If we go back to the level here, and let's just drag out this material instance. Oh, we need to just don't forget to save and apply that material. And now you'll see there is a new parameter group here called RVT with 4 new attributes here. So if you go over to the landscape, you can see there's a little bit of blending now happening at the bottom. So if we go through these attributes, the blend start, in fact, let's make the blend transition 0 here. If you make the blend start something like 50 units, you can see that it's blending up from the ground level up to 50 units above the landscape. But in general, you want to have a small blend start and then a transition that acts like a gradient so that it fades into the original color of the item. The blend normal just means you can hover over it and you see it says if you have a value of 0, it only blends upward facing faces. So if you do 0 here, it will only do the faces that are facing up at the bottom. If you do 1, it uses the side faces as well. And then this last checkbox here, currently it doesn't take into account the normals of the mesh itself. It's just using the normals of the underlying texture. So everything will look like it's pointing upwards. So in most cases, not all, but in most cases you want to check this on and you'll get a more realistic result, especially on the side faces. You can see when we check off now that really blends nicely now into the landscape underneath. So that's the first method of doing it, by using that RVT blend with material attributes. But sometimes you have materials that don't use the material attributes output. So if that's the case, so for example, this grass over here that I provide as a sample, you can see that it blends into the landscape, these ones down near the front, blending in with that sort of browny color, and the ones in the middle are blending in with the green underneath. So if we look at those grass elements, go into here, Go into the Landscape Auto Meshes folder, Grass, and you'll see there's a material there called M-Grass. If I open that up, you can see that the output here is not material attributes, it's all of the pins for everything. So if that's the case, all you need to do is you need to find out where the base color and the normal are being used, and then instead of using the RVT blend with MA, just use the RVT blend on its own, and that will then have separate pins for color and normal. So you plug in the color and the normal where you would normally plug them into the output, and then you'll get the blended color and the blended normal, and you can plug those into the relevant inputs, and then you'll get those RVT parameters. And the end result will be exactly the same as you saw with the tree stump. So that ends the tutorial here. I'm sure at some point in the future I'll do some additional videos, especially if Quix or Bridge goes away and we need to find another way of getting those displacement textures. But for now, this has been a long video, probably almost 2 hours, so feel free to skip around the chapters and find the bits you want. And I really hope you enjoy using this Landscape Auto Material tool. Join the Discord if you've got any questions or comments, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye for now.